right. Hey, how's it going, everyone? Catherine Mattice here, and we're going to talk about hiring in the age of AI and using AI to hire. Hope everyone's well. I have the CEO and founder of Skillfully, Brett Waikart. I love how you, Brett, you put your phonetic in there. Thanks for your phonetics. That was helpful. It's like way-cart. Anyway, so you built Skillfully. You're focused on kind of getting past those AI written resumes and helping job seekers really develop their ability to be seen and so forth. So thanks for coming.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. And what a time to be able to talk about all this. There's a lot going on in the world.
I know. I read Mark Zuckerberg's manifesto. I think that it came out yesterday or the day before. So that's on my mind as well. So real quick, how did you come to start Skillfully? Why this product?
Yeah. Skillfully started as a labor of love. Skillfully started without us ever imagining it would turn into Skillfully. Skillfully actually started as a nonprofit. I helped to co-found probably 11, 12 years ago at this point. I was working in the finance industry, and I was very aware that a lot of the skills that those of us working in the securities industry, working on Wall Street, a lot of those skills that we take for granted are skills that are necessary for day-to-day life. It's for protecting your own personal financial security, protecting that future. And it was very, very quickly apparent that a lot of the skills you take for granted that are just kind of part of the job are skills that are not taught broadly. And whether that's the curriculum of the public school system, whether that's just kind of the level of exposure that young people get to those skills, basic financial and investment literacy was just really kind of a non-existent skill set. When you look around at young people just ending their student career and entering the workforce. And so we created a nonprofit called Portfolios with Purpose, purely as a skill development platform. So we had a ton of students come in. Everyone participated in kind of a fun investment contest that let everybody just invest in stocks for the very first time and kind of understand how the market works. But then we layered a lot of classes and a lot of instruction on top of that. It just so happened that a choice we made very early on was that the teaching mechanism we were going to rely on would be simulations. So scenario-based learning, which has really become something that's kind of been drawn to the forefront in the last couple of years.
Yeah.
Theory being, listen, people aren't not learning these skills because of a lack of textbooks, because of a lack of content, but of a lack of engaging content. And so we chose simulations as the modality to teach those skills. We had a lot of success. And it turns out that a lot of the skills we were teaching have a tremendous amount of overlap with the job skills employers in the financial services industry are looking to hire for. And so we had a platform that was serving between 10 and 20,000 students a year. We would get a really good understanding of who had a high degree of proficiency with the skills that mattered, the skills we focused on. And it turns out that information was really interesting to employers. And so we started getting approached by some of the largest investment banks, some of the largest financial services companies in the world. And they expressed a very real appetite for data that was an alternative to how somebody might appear on a resume. We worked with a lot of community college students, a lot of college dropouts, a lot of folks that just don't necessarily look good on a traditional piece of paper. They don't conform to the average, so the kind of expectations. However, they really had extraordinary levels of proficiency with the skills that matter. And that's really kind of what gave birth to this alternative way of doing employment.
So like street smarts versus what you learned in college or how you look on paper. I love that. And so Skillfully is something that employers can use to help them identify people who have the right skills, the right proficiencies beyond the resume.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So Skillfully was born in that little kind of seed of knowledge that employers were interested and they had an appetite for more skill data, more proficiency data outside of what's typically given in a resume or a cover letter. And so when we started Skillfully, we started it obviously as a for-profit tech company, but the idea being we thought it was possible to create a simulation platform that could represent the key tasks, workflows, the tools that were being used of just about any, at least knowledge job for sure. And so we focus a lot in technology and professional services. But for those roles, our theory, our hypothesis was that we can recreate a very realistic version of just about any kind of work that's going to be done through the computer. So Skillfully, we have our own custom infrastructure that allows us to layer and orchestrate many different AI models in the creation of these virtual scenarios, these simulations of how work is actually done. So to your point, when we work with employers, what we can do is we can start from a job description. We can start from doing a little bit of research to create simulations that model the work, the job that they're looking to fill. And then instead of collecting resumes, employers can invite applicants to go through those simulations. And if we have folks on our platform for 10, 15, 20 minutes doing the work, we get a really good textured, granular understanding of what skills they're really strong with, where there's maybe still room to grow. And we can paint a really compelling picture about how that applicant would behave, how they would perform should they be in the actual role on day one. And so that's been really an interesting thread to keep pulling.
Yeah, I remember teaching, I've been in the business for 25 years now in the world of HR. I remember teaching a class, like, tell me about a time you had a customer who was angry, and
exactly.
Questions were still good, but this is way better.
Exactly. No, and it's really, really fun. It's you're absolutely right. The traditional way of doing hiring, it is just open to so many different sources of subjectivity, of an interviewer's perception of a response to a question just like that. When you step back and you realize, you start to look at the typical credentials of the employment process, someone's resume, the description of what their past has been, their cover letter, why they describe, why they think they'd be really good fit for this job, any interview, you're always looking through a different lens, trying to understand how that person might behave on the job. You're always looking at, example A in order to get an understanding of example B. And that's a problem. There's always a translation gap. There's always some difference in your perception of those descriptions and then how they actually work on the job. And so the thesis behind Skillfully is, well, if we can collapse that down, if we can eliminate daylight entirely, and we can give employers the chance to basically look over the shoulder of an applicant doing the work, performing in the job, well, we can remove a lot of that subjectivity. We can remove a lot of that translation buffer, and we can instead let the applicant's skills shine. And maybe that applicant doesn't come from an Ivy League school. Maybe they haven't been doing this work for their entire career, but they still may be really gifted and really, really talented. And that is what's going to matter more on day one. So it's a really interesting evolution.
Sorry to interrupt you. So you're saying essentially, this skips over the resume. It's not send your resumes and then we'll invite you to take these tests if we decide we like your resume. You're flipping the script and saying this is essentially where the job posting is, and applicants can take the time to show what they've got, and then the employer can go from there with a resume or whatever they want.
Yeah, and there's kind of a dual benefit to both the applicant and to the employer when we're used that way. So a lot of employers will use us as an introduction tool, as what kind of gets called career demystification. So we can build simulations of a particular role, and employers can stand that up and make that broadly available for anybody who's curious about what it might be to work in banking versus marketing versus a legal profession. We do this really often where we partner with universities or community colleges, and we get offered through something like the Career Service Center. But we're a resource for an applicant to dip a toe in the water and see, okay, do I like this work? Am I good at this work? Is this something I can get excited about? That's good for the candidate. And then for the employer, from the very first interaction, the employer is getting an understanding of, okay, how is this person predisposed? How do they think? How do they solve problems? What are their kind of baseline scores for the skills that we know are going to be super important to our workforce today and in the future? So we're typically given alongside the request for a resume. It's kind of usually at the same step, but we are usually deployed very, very early in a recruiting process.
I love that. I love that. I feel like there's a research way to, I was thinking about yourself, right? And like, I wonder if I could do something and like ask internal HR people to fill it out and then be able to sort of prove or disprove that, we're culture consultants, that in the 300 people who filled this out who are internal HR, they weren't very good at doing culture problems, or they were, I don't know. We might have to talk about that offline.
We've done some really interesting research with some of our bigger customers where we'll essentially run a dual track where applicants will go through Skillfully simulations, and then they'll also go through the traditional submit a resume, come through multiple interviews, and then let's see what the results look like. Let's see what the conclusions are.
The A/B testing.
Yeah, a little bit of that. And what we found is that the biggest gap, the biggest difference is that the system, the Skillfully platform, we will detect candidates who are really well skilled, who are well equipped to do the job, who might get weeded out or filtered out of an interview process because maybe they just have a personality that doesn't necessarily fit with the disposition of an interviewer, or maybe they didn't show up on a resume, or maybe they, one little misstep along that process. What we found is that can be quite large. That number can be as big as 20 or 30 of the 20 or 30% of applicants who go through a process very often have the skills to be excellent, to be extraordinary in a particular job, but because of a process that has a little bit of subjectivity, a lot of times employers don't always select purely for, do you have the right skills? There's other factors that come in, and we can have a really fun conversation around, okay, like could be a good thing, could be a bad thing.
Yeah. So, tons of research. There's one I like to cite a lot when I'm talking about bias. At MIT, they did some research where they had some graduate students whiten their resume, as they called it. And this was with Black students and Asian students. So these students had one version that, it was very clear they were Black or Asian. They were president of the Black Student Union, and their name is very cultural. And that was the resume they'd send out. And then they did a second version that was whitened where they, made it so their name wasn't so culture. It was John Smith. And, if they're president of the Black Student Union, they removed that, just president of the student union. And so then they compared callbacks on the real resume versus the one that had been whitened. And, the callbacks on the whitened version were like 30% higher than callback. Same resume, only difference is the name and some of these things. And so doing it this way, and I know there's applications out there where you can, the application removes some of that stuff in an attempt.
As does ours.
But this is even better. It's like, it doesn't really matter what their name is. You've got the proof of the skills.
Well, that's exactly it. And I've seen that same research. And obviously those are very large, very well-respected studies. I'm sure there is a role that plays for sure.
Yeah.
What we see, our data, we don't focus on race, on gender. What we're looking at is the distance between someone's demonstrated skill set, so demonstrated as we observed, as evaluated in our simulations that are meant to model the actual job they're applying to, versus their described skill level. And described skills can show up in their resume where maybe they're saying, oh, I did this for the last 10 years and I got it, nailed.
Yeah, of course, we all bump up ourselves a little bit too.
Resume inflation is, I think, one version of what you're talking about, where the resume itself as a document is highly susceptible to having the author of that resume turn the volume up or down on various factors, whatever it might be. The most common one is overrepresenting your experience, overrepresenting your skills. And then listen, because we live in a hiring regime that for the last 50 years, the norm, the assumption has been, okay, we're going to take you at your word. If you write this on your resume, we're going to trust that and move that forward.
Yeah.
Fact of the matter is, especially in the day and age where we all have our Claude or Chat GPT sitting up and we can say, hey, here's a job description, rewrite my resume to be the best possible resume for that opportunity.
Yeah.
They're not optimizing for truth. They're not optimizing for a realistic portrayal of who you are and what you can do. They're optimizing for keyword matching and making sure that they make you sound as good as possible. And so that gap between demonstrated and described skills just grows, and it's never been wider than it is today. That's the core challenge a lot of employers are trying to wrestle with right now.
Yeah, and I think this just is a really great way to overcome the bias that of just, can you do it or not? What's the gap between what we need you to do and where you're at? What about, so it's interesting because, lots of stuff out there that AI creates bias or is biased, and a side note story that's kind of irrelevant, but I asked, we have a cat and a dog here, and we're divided as a family on whether we're cat people or dog people. I asked Alexa, I said, Alexa, what do dogs think about? And it was like their owners, and they love their owner. It was all about how much they love. And then I said, what do cats think about? And it said, cats are predators. So that's what they think about. And I was like, somebody's biased. Anyway, so I think you're sort of turning that on its head, where you're actually fighting bias, and maybe that's not necessarily why you started the company, but you sure are doing that.
Skillfully is a public benefit corporation. So there are a few other companies out there that are PBCs. Anthropic is a public benefit corporation. A couple other large tech companies have been structured that way. All that means is that for Skillfully, for our management, for our board, we make decisions based off of two priorities. One, the traditional financial motive. We want to be a growing, scaling business that's profitable, generates value for our shareholders. But then two, as a social enterprise, we have a mission that we want to uphold. And we will not make decisions that honor the financial mission, but compromise the social mission. The social mission for us is creating a more equitable, more accessible pathway to meaningful career opportunity that's based off of your demonstrated ability. Pure and simple, what we want to do is just make the hiring process, the hiring regime, more responsive to your actual skill level and your ability to do the work, not all of the other factors that sometimes influence that decision. And so, you can restate that as saying we would like to minimize factors that elevate bias or elevate the role of perception and subjectivity in the hiring decision. We really want to focus on someone's demonstrated ability. In a very real way, that's what we're focused on.
Yeah, I have another question for you. I read the other day that I think it was Stanford did a study on a lot of the AI tools that recruiters use, and essentially that there are only so many, so we send our resumes in, it goes through a tool that employer is using, but there's only so many of those tools available. And that those tools are hanging on to your information. So if you apply, or if I apply with my resume to 5 different companies and they're all using the same application to review resumes, that I'm sort of screwed. It's already made a decision on me based on that first time I submitted it, as opposed to it sort of giving me a new profile for each employer. Is that fair? And talk to me about what you think about that. And does Skillfully do that? Skillfully
certainly does not. I I am sure that a lot of different employers use very similar tools that are wired and programmed to be the same way. Skillfully does not maintain a common pool of applicants that are recycled, or we don't pull data. So let's say if an applicant applies to one role on Skillfully and then to a second, there's no correlation between those scores that we're creating. All we're looking at are your demonstrated abilities in that particular session that's linked to whatever the employment opportunities you're going after. What I do know that's happening out there in the market that probably contributes to what the Stanford article is referencing. I think the way that AI is used is really only, there's really only 2 or 3 different ways that AI is being applied to the recruitment question. And I think it's really useful to step back and think really quickly about when you use AI to inform a hiring decision, what's really happening there. Using AI like a large language model, like an agent, the AI itself is just intelligence. It is just a decision-making node that takes in some type of data and then outputs some kind of a decision.
Yeah.
That intelligence itself is very rarely the source of bias, is the source of subjectivity. That intelligence, in a certain sense, it's a pure expression of the data that you're putting into context of that AI. So when we say that a lot of different platforms out there use AI in a very similar but a very narrow set of ways, it's typically because AI or intelligence is being applied to some data set that is exactly the same as any other job you might apply to. Typically what's happening, and this was very much the first wave of AI, people said, oh, great, I have this intelligence, I have this decision-making machine. Well, I'm going to apply this to the same data I've always used, to the same inputs that have always been part of the process. And so you see a lot of AI inference. So you place somebody's resume and maybe the job description they're applying to, and you put that into AI. And all that AI can do is try to pattern match, draw a correlation between the data that's in the resume and the data that's in the job description. And so what you see there is that the AI decision is really reflective of whatever bias is present in that underlying data or those underlying documents. And so if a resume was written to maybe exaggerate the ability of the applicant or to overemphasize certain factors, then AI is going to make decisions based off of that. It's going to take that resume at its word. That's not necessarily an employer who's biased. That's not necessarily even a system that's biased. It is over reliance on a particular type of data, that input. AI is not going to change the limitations of the data. It's just going to be able to translate whatever data you give to it. So for Skillfully, what we've done is we've changed that underlying data. We've changed the input. So instead of it being a description of ability, we want to have it be that demonstration observed in the simulations. So the decisions that come out are not just layered on top of the subjectivity or the bias of that pre-existing document, the maybe already problematic CV or record of someone's accomplishments. It's much more reflective of their contemporaneous ability to demonstrate skills in the context of the job. We're not the only ones who do it. I don't mean to say that we have a monopoly on that approach, but I think when you talk about those type of broad studies, I start thinking about there are so many companies out there that can just basically sprinkle a little AI dust on a pre-existing process and say, hey, look at this, it's brand new, and it's honestly still really, really problematic. That's how I look at that kind of dynamic in the industry.
Yeah, I mean, you've got me thinking. So I don't know, I'm sure you've read Mark Zuckerberg's manifesto. Did you read it? Or you're aware of what's that? Okay. I figured you had. And I'm no AI expert, that's for sure. And I think what I got from it and from what I'm hearing from you and just the example you set with Skillfully, and by the way, if you haven't read Mark Zuckerberg's manifesto, you can easily Google it and find it. It essentially says that we can turn it on its head right now. and I'm super simplifying, but that, right now we're all afraid that AI will take our jobs, but that Mark's intention is to put that super intelligent in the hands of everybody, which flips the script a little. So that's my super oversimplification. Where I'm going with this is, I think, and you did it. We have to think about things differently. So you're saying right now we know stuff and we think critically about stuff and we apply those skills when we're using AI. But if we're really going to be using AI in better ways to advance humans and advance our own careers and so on, that we have to think about things differently. We have to think critically in all new ways. So maybe AI isn't stealing our ability to think critically, which is what a lot of people say. It's forcing us to think about things differently. I mean, with Skillfully, you've essentially said, we're not doing that anymore. This thing we've been doing for 200 years, let's not do that anymore. So that is a big ask, but I think it's something all of us humans need to start really thinking, like, how can we turn things on their head? Right?
I think that's exactly right. I think if I step out of Mark's manifesto, because I do think that's also a very self-serving position that he's taking.
And he didn't write it
there's
by
a lot
himself,
there.
It was on my mind because I read it.
No, for sure, absolutely. No, it's in the news, and Meta is a very important player in the market. It's all very, very relevant. The advice that is most universally applicable for anybody out there in the market is that in order to benefit from AI, start using it and just get into a tool, get into Claude, get into any of these applications that are always all of them almost have a free tier. They have a very low price tier, enough for you to kind of start interacting with the tool and understanding what it can do.
Yeah. Those
frontier model products, that's step one of a much longer journey that we as a society are on right now, where that's you interacting with the raw intelligence in the most distilled form. If you go a step further, companies like Skillfully that have said, oh, this is an interesting input. This is an interesting, let's think of it as a single brick in a much larger building that we're trying to construct. If you start looking at AI as placeable intelligence, deployable intelligence in a process, what gets really interesting is that you can start reimagining how legacy processes that we've taken for granted for decades, if not for hundreds of years, can be reshaped. Us, Skillfully is one example, but the paradigm we're breaking. We've always relied on resumes because it's impossible as an employer for you to witness and observe the actual work of every single person who applies to a job. And so what's the next best thing? Okay, well, let me use a resume. This is going to be an easy way to distill this down. If you go back to that fundamental premise that you don't have enough time, you don't have enough hours in the day to look at every single person applying to a job, do the actual work. Well, it turns out that AI allows you to do that. You can basically rent that intelligence. You can use a platform like Skillfully and effectively peer over the shoulder of everyone applying to a job. Okay, that breaks the very first premise that led to our reliance on resumes in the first place.
Yeah.
And if that's no longer the case, then what's possible? What can we then imagine to rebuild how people find and succeed at work? That gets really, really interesting. If people don't take that first step, though, of going out and trying these tools and playing with this intelligence and experimenting with this and just in the safety of their own home, they will risk missing the boat, missing the train when all of these new processes get reimagined and implemented. I think it's incredibly exciting. I think there is a world of, whether you want to call it abundance, whether you want to call it greater agency in terms of how you work and how you spend your time. I do think that that is a very, very realistic outcome of what we're going through right now, but man, are we in turmoil as we try to digest what's going on, and we start breaking those old processes to be able to rebuild what's going to come next.
Yeah.
Really interesting time to be alive and to be building. Let me tell you
Yeah,
that.
I think I know we're at time, and I do have another call, but I guess it sounds like what you're saying is you can kind of look at a process you follow, maybe pick a point in it and go, what are the other ways we could reimagine this? And maybe you are the next creator of some big cool AI thing.
You never know. Let's hope. But I appreciate it, Catherine. Thank you for the conversation.
Thank
This was
you
great.
so much. I really appreciated meeting with you, and all of you who watched. Thanks for joining us. And Brett, great to see you again.
Yep. See you soon. I'm
Bye.
sure. See you, Catherine.